Let's talk theology for a moment. Is this still apply to New Testament believers? Is this something that maybe just hinges on your particular eschatology? Should Christians support Israel only if they have a particular eschatology, or is this just across the board apply to all Christians?
I've engaged with tons of people on this question, and the evangelical church is split far more than you would think. There are a lot of Christians who believe that Jesus died as a Jew and rose again as a Christian, and Christians are not relevant, or Jews are not relevant anymore. Okay, you can support them politically, but they're not relevant in terms of your faith. The biblical perspective is, I do not see it agreeing with that. If it does, it's much more nuanced. You go all the way back to Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant, which was God making a covenant with himself on behalf of Abraham. That covenant was there were always two parts: with the people in the land, with the people in the land. Every single Old Testament reference you find is about the people in the land. The land was central to this covenant that God was making. Well, the Apostle Paul came along, and there were a lot of Jews who were trying to kill him for saying that Jesus was the resurrected Christ and the coming and the prophesied Messiah. Peter prophesied the same. He said the same thing. He said those prophets were talking about Jesus. So that's a Christian belief. That's New Testament. That's what we believe. But what about the Jews? The Apostle Paul was fascinating about this. In Galatians chapter 3, he said, those who believe are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. What's that blessing? That God will bless them, and through them all nations of the earth will be blessed. We are inheritors of that covenant. What about the Jews? Are they still part of the covenant? Well, Paul addressed this very specifically in Romans chapter 11. And he said, Christians have been grafted into God's root. I just can't believe there's so much discussion on, well, maybe the Jews have been grafted out. Maybe some Jews have just been grafted out. I really think we should be amazed that Christians were grafted in. That's a pretty
Right.
extraordinary move on God's part,
Yeah.
to graft us into a covenant that we had no right to claim for ourselves, but that's actually important to God himself. So I would think about that. Whether all Jews are still part of God's covenant or not is something God alone can decide. Because, the nature of the Abrahamic covenant was Abraham divided the animals. That's the way you do a covenant. Then both people walk between, and they essentially say, if I break my part of the covenant, do to me what you did to these animals. It's a very serious commitment.
Yeah.
You're signing with your life on the line when you make a covenant. Well, the animals were divided. God put Abraham into a deep sleep, and God alone walked through the pieces.
Right.
It's not a covenant with Abraham, technically. It is a covenant God made with himself on behalf of Abraham. So this is God's covenant with himself. This is not something that we can say, well, our theology's changed now, so we don't have to support that anymore. But what happened in history? Well, people didn't have a nation of Israel, so they just assumed that Israel was a spiritual entity. John Calvin assumed that. Most of the church fathers assumed, well, Israel doesn't exist anymore, so it must just be a spiritual concept. And we make metaphors out of everything. But now that Israel's reconstituted as a nation with those same founding principles in place, it's thrown a lot of people into confusion. It's really messed up their theology that Israel now does exist as an actual nation. You either have to deny that it's legitimate, or you have to acknowledge that the restoration prophecies from, say, Amos may now actually be coming true.
You mentioned earlier that some of the original anti-Semitism, at least in more recent times, came from Christians. Do you think that some of those early church fathers, with that theology, was that maybe informed by anti-Semitism? Do you think?
It could have been, but at the time, anti-Semitism had a different look because Israel didn't exist as a physical nation. So anti-Semitism in those days focused on, how do we know somebody's a Jew? And Adolf Hitler said, well, anybody who has any Jewish blood at all and ever, they're a Jew. They could be completely secular. They could be an atheist. Doesn't matter. We're still going to kill them. So he does not distinguish between religious or secular Jews. But I think the idea of the covenant is God doesn't distinguish that way either. We sometimes think that if we're really good, God might accept us into his covenant. And this is not God's calculus. This is not the way God approaches it. It is not about our righteousness. It's about his call. So I pray that all of my Jewish friends come to faith in Jesus. I pray that Jews who are secular and have no religious basis I pray that they will have a revival. I'm seeing it happen in a lot of different places, but I pray it the same way as I pray for, the children of Christian families, these,
Yeah.
kids who walk away. It's the same kind of prayer. I'm not making any judgment about their eternal state. That's not for me to decide. That's God's decision. But I can pray that they will be restored to Him. And that's what I pray.